From the very first moment I observe Peter Pan, I'm struck by the profound simplicity of his refusal to grow up. Many believe it to be an act of rebellion, a whimsical refusal to obey the rules of adulthood. Yet when I look through the lens of the psyche, I see something far deeper at work. Peter remains a child, not because he rejects adulthood in a conscious, deliberate way, but because childhood itself functions as a sanctuary for his inner world. It's a state of being where desire, fantasy, and omnipotence coexist without contradiction. To him, childhood is not a phase, it is a fortress, a place protected from all the wounds and anxieties that the adult world inevitably brings. When I examine Peter's flight, I do not see merely the magical ability to rise above the ground. I see a psychological maneuver. His flying represents a refusal to be weighed down by the burdens of adulthood, responsibility, duty, limitation. The adult world demands compromise, self-restraint, and the acceptance that one's wishes cannot always be fulfilled. For Peter, these demands feel like threats to his psychic integrity. His instinct is to escape, and so he quite literally lifts himself above the reality he fears will crush him. In this act, he preserves a space where his desires remain untouched by consequence. The Neverland he inhabits is not a geographical place, but a psychic one. It is the externalization of a child's inner universe, boundless, chaotic, and governed by wishes rather than rules. In Neverland, danger and wonder coexist side by side, mirroring the emotional intensity of childhood. But even these dangers are symbolic. Pirates, mermaids, and fairies serve as manifestations of the unprocessed conflicts that swirl within him. Yet unlike the adult world, where such conflicts must eventually be confronted, Neverland allows Peter to keep these forces in perpetual play without ever resolving them. It is a world where emotional stasis masquerades as adventure. When I analyze his refusal to grow up as a psychological defense, I recognize a pattern familiar to my clinical work: the avoidance of loss. To grow up is, inevitably, to lose something. The limitless freedom of childhood, the illusion of boundless potential, the belief that one can remain the center of the universe. Peter clings to childhood because he fears that adulthood would demand a psychic castration, a reduction of his grandiosity, a surrender of his fantasies, and the painful acceptance of mortality. For him, growing up feels synonymous with losing everything that makes him feel alive. I also recognize that Peter's eternal youth shields him from emotional attachments that could expose his vulnerabilities. To form deep bonds, as adults must, is to risk heartbreak, disappointment, and dependency. These are experiences that require a solidified ego capable of tolerating ambivalence and loss. Peter's psyche is not prepared for such complexity. By remaining a boy, he remains unburdened by the weight of commitment. His relationships, especially with Wendy, reveal this dynamic clearly. He desires affection, but retreats the moment it threatens to anchor him in emotional reality. In this sense, his flight is not only physical, it is emotional. Of course, every refusal carries a price. By eliminating the pain of adulthood, Peter also eliminates its pleasures: growth, intimacy, self-discovery. His victory over responsibility comes at the cost of a richer, more integrated sense of self. The eternal boy avoids suffering by avoiding becoming. He preserves his freedom, but at the expense of depth. The child who never grows up becomes paradoxically a prisoner of his own fantasy, a being condemned to repeat the same cycle of play without ever evolving from it. When I speak of Peter Pan as the embodiment of the psyche's longing for eternal childhood, I do not do so to condemn him, but to illuminate a universal conflict. Within each of us lives a part that would prefer to remain in the psychic safety of youth, untouched by consequence or time. We all carry a Peter Pan inside us. But to mature is not merely to surrender joy or imagination. Rather, it is to integrate these qualities into a stronger, more resilient self. Peter refuses this integration, choosing instead to preserve the sanctuary of childhood at all costs. And so he remains suspended, forever flying, forever fleeing, forever escaping the gravity of becoming fully human. As I examine the nature of Neverland, I immediately recognize it not as a simple magical island, but as a profound symbol of the unconscious itself. In this place where time dissolves and consequences rarely exist, we find the perfect representation of mental life freed from the burdens of reality. Neverland is not a geographical location, it is a psychic landscape. It is constructed from desires that long to be satisfied and memories that refuse to be acknowledged. Peter Pan does not merely visit this realm, he dwells in it because it spares him from the painful demands of maturity. When I observe the way Neverland bends its form to Peter's imagination, I recognize the classic dynamics of wish fulfillment. In dreams, the mind constructs entire worlds to gratify repressed wishes. Neverland functions in precisely the same way. It molds itself to Peter's fear of growing up, his longing for eternal freedom, and his refusal to submit to the symbolic order of adulthood. The pirates, fairies, mermaids, and lost boys are not random curiosities. They are dramatizations of psychic fragments that Peter keeps alive by banishing them from reality. Each creature that inhabits Neverland represents an impulse or a desire that would be unacceptable or unbearable in the adult world. The fairies symbolize fleeting pleasures and momentary whims, bright and impulsive. The mermaids embody seductive fantasies, eroticized yet distant, reflecting Peter's early encounters with burgeoning desire that he is not yet ready to integrate. The pirates mirror aggression, authority, and danger, parts of life that Peter both fears and resists. In other words, Neverland is Peter's unconscious given form, populated by the very forces he avoids confronting. The absence of time in Neverland is perhaps one of its most telling features. The unconscious does not follow linear chronology. It preserves conflicts, fantasies, and fears with the same intensity through the years. For Peter, this suspension of time is more than magical convenience. It is a psychological necessity. Growing older would force him to face the limits of his fantasy, the finitude of life, and the inevitability of separation. By erasing time, Neverland becomes a refuge from all these anxieties, allowing him to live in an eternal present where no wound heals because no wound is ever allowed to form. But this sanctuary is also a trap. Living entirely within the domain of fantasy prevents Peter from constructing a stable identity in the real world. Neverland allows him to indulge every impulse, but it also isolates him from the relations and responsibilities that shape a mature psyche. In the adult world, identity is forged through conflict, compromise, and loss, all experiences Peter refuses to endure. Thus, Neverland, while enchanting, also imprisons him in a form of perpetual psychic immaturity. When I reflect upon the relationship between Neverland and the external world, I see a split forming within Peter's psyche. He oscillates between fantasy and reality, yearning for the boundless pleasure of the former and yet drawn, however reluctantly, to the affection and intimacy found in the latter. Wendy's presence exposes this conflict most clearly, for she brings with her the promise of emotional development, of growing up, of accepting vulnerability. Her invitation to leave Neverland is not merely a plot point. It is the symbolic call of the unconscious, urging Peter toward integration. Ultimately, Neverland exists because Peter is not prepared to endure the anguish that accompanies adulthood. It is a magnificent construction, born from repression and sustained by wish fulfillment, yet it stands as evidence of his internal struggle. By choosing Neverland over the real world, Peter reveals his deepest fear, that he lacks the psychological strength to confront loss, responsibility, and desire. Thus I conclude that Neverland is not simply a place where Peter avoids growing up. It is the psychic fortress he erects to protect himself from the pain he imagines adulthood would inevitably inflict. When I observe Peter Pan alongside the Lost Boys, I do not see a group of children merely seeking adventure. I see a mind attempting to hold itself together. To me, each of these boys reflects a splintered portion of Peter's own psyche, fragments left behind at moments of emotional stagnation. In every child who follows him, I recognize a desire, a fear, or a developmental task that Peter himself abandoned. He surrounds himself with these internal echoes as a way to avoid the loneliness that inevitably emerges when one refuses to grow. In psychoanalytic terms, the Lost Boys express what I call fixations, aspects of the self that never progressed past earlier stages of emotional development. Peter does not outgrow them because he does not outgrow himself. Each boy embodies an impulse that Peter cannot integrate: exuberance, mischief, dependency, rebellion, all functioning in isolation, unable to form a unified adult identity. By externalizing these parts as separate companions, Peter avoids confronting the internal fragmentation that defines him. I find it fascinating that Peter insists on leading them, placing himself above them as their captain. This is, of course, a symbolic attempt to claim mastery over the chaos within. Yet, ironically, he is no more mature than they are. His leadership is a fantasy of control. He commands them not because he is stronger or wiser, but because he cannot bear the idea that these fragmented impulses might overwhelm him. In that sense, his authority is a defense mechanism, a denial of his own emotional immaturity. Their world of playful battles, endless games, and rule-free existence represents an elaborate psychic stage where Peter reenacts unresolved internal conflicts. Instead of integrating these parts into a coherent self, he reenacts their energies again and again, maintaining a perpetual loop of emotional childhood. The Lost Boys follow him because they are him. They obey because they cannot be anything other than what Peter allows himself to be: incomplete, unformed, and stuck. When I analyze their interactions, I notice that none of the Lost Boys possess clear memories of their past or stable identities. This amnesia is meaningful. It reflects Peter's own repression, the parts of him he has pushed so deeply into the unconscious that they no longer remember their origin. These forgotten fragments drift in a timeless space, mirroring how Peter himself resists any linear progression of life. He prefers stasis to the anxiety brought on by growth, and so Peter's companionship with the Lost Boys is not a triumph of friendship, but a tragedy of psychic division. He surrounds himself with these children because they reassure him that remaining immature is acceptable. They reinforce his denial. As long as they stay young, he can stay young. As long as they remain incomplete, he can avoid the pain of becoming whole. Yet this illusion comes at a cost. Peter never experiences the psychological unity that adulthood requires. Ultimately, the Lost Boys reveal a profound truth. Peter Pan is not simply a boy who refuses to grow up. He is a boy who cannot become one person. His psyche is scattered across the figures who follow him, each one representing a piece he is unwilling or unable to reclaim. Until Peter confronts these fragments and welcomes them back into himself, he will continue leading a band of children through Neverland, never realizing that the one who is truly lost is him. As I observe the figure of Captain Hook, I immediately recognize in him the embodiment of the fear that dominates Peter Pan's inner world. Hook is not merely an antagonist placed conveniently in the narrative. He is the living representation of everything the boy refuses to confront. In my clinical experience, the human psyche often externalizes its deepest anxieties into monstrous or threatening figures, and Hook serves precisely this function. He stands as the adult world personified, rigid, punitive, demanding, and therefore becomes the perfect vessel for Peter's dread of leaving childhood behind. When I consider Hook's demeanor, his obsession with rules, order, and revenge, I see reflected in him the harsh superego that develops as one matures. This inner authority judges, corrects, and punishes, often with far greater cruelty than any external figure could. Peter, whose psyche is still bound to the pleasures and freedoms of childhood, perceives in Hook an overwhelming force that threatens to crush his fantasies and impose the heavy burden of responsibility. It is no wonder that Peter insists on remaining distant, playful, and airborne. Flight becomes an escape from the demands symbolized by this menacing adult. The hook replacing Hook's hand is a detail of great psychological significance. In psychoanalytic terms, it is an unmistakable symbol of castration, the loss of power that one experiences when confronted with the expectations and limitations of adulthood. Where a hand once allowed him to grasp, create, and act freely, now there is a rigid, sharp instrument that serves only to wound. To Peter, this mutilation is a terrifying reminder of the sacrifices required to grow up, the surrender of fantasy, omnipotence, and limitless desire. Hook's body itself becomes a warning of what might happen if Peter abandons his eternal boyhood. In my reading, the ongoing conflict between Peter and Hook mirrors the internal battle that many patients face when torn between desire and duty. On one side, there is the wish to remain free, spontaneous, and untouched by the complexities of adult life. On the other, the unavoidable pull of maturity, with all its anxieties and responsibilities. Hook's relentless pursuit of Peter reflects the psychic reality that adulthood, no matter how fiercely resisted, cannot be avoided forever. Peter's evasiveness, however graceful, is tinged with desperation, the desperation of a psyche trying to outrun its own development. Hook's interactions with Peter also reveal an important truth about fear. What we flee often grows larger and more powerful in our minds. The captain's exaggerated theatrics, his intensity, and even his dependence on violence are magnified through Peter's imagination. In reality, the adult world may not be as cruel as Hook appears, but to a child terrified of growing up, every demand feels like an attack. Thus, Hook's frightening presence is less about who he is and more about what he represents, the intrusion of the real into a realm built entirely on fantasy. Yet I must emphasize that Hook is not solely a figure of terror. He is also the essential counterpart without whom Peter's identity could not sustain itself. A fantasy of eternal youth requires a meaningful opposition to remain stable. Without the shadow of adulthood embodied by Hook, Neverland would dissolve into pure chaos, lacking the tension that gives Peter's refusal to grow up its dramatic power. In this way, Hook secretly supports the very fantasy he seeks to destroy, for his existence validates Peter's flight. Ultimately, I understand Peter's fear of Hook as a profound psychological truth. The process of growing up often feels like a threat to the very core of who we believe ourselves to be. Hook is the shape that this fear takes, sharp, rigid, authoritative, and unyielding. When Peter fights him, he's not merely defending his island or his friends, he is defending the last refuge of his childhood psyche. And while he may triumph again and again, the deeper truth remains unchanged. One cannot remain a child forever, and the adult world, with all its demands, waits patiently in the shadows, much like Hook himself. When I observe Peter's relationship with Wendy, I immediately recognize the unmistakable tension between desire and fear. Wendy represents something profoundly disruptive to his psychic equilibrium, the possibility of emotional intimacy. In my work, I have seen countless patients drawn irresistibly to the tenderness they simultaneously dread. Peter stands at this precipice. He senses in Wendy a warmth that calls him toward connection. But for him, such closeness carries the unbearable threat of adulthood, of responsibility, vulnerability, and inevitable loss. Wendy is, in many ways, the first figure who invites Peter to consider himself not merely as a boy lost in fantasy, but as a being capable of love. This alone confronts him with a new and overwhelming question. What would it mean to step out of the eternal freedom of Neverland and into the structured, unpredictable terrain of human relationships? The very thought destabilizes him. Wendy embodies the emerging emotional life that Peter has been fleeing since the moment he chose to remain forever young. To Peter, love is not just affection, it is transformation. And transformation in the psyche of a child determined never to mature is intolerable. I have often said that the developing mind resists anything that threatens to dismantle its defenses. Wendy is precisely such a threat. Her presence signals the possibility of integrating imagination with reality, of merging fantasy with affection, of becoming a whole subject rather than a fractured boy ruling over fragments of himself. But to embrace her would require Peter to relinquish the omnipotence of the child and accept the uncertainty of the adult. At the same time, it is clear to me that Peter is enchanted by Wendy. He lingers near her, watching her with curiosity and admiration, longing for what she represents. Yet the moment she extends the bridge toward emotional connection, offering care, stability, or the suggestion of a future, Peter recoils. This ambivalence is not unique. It arises whenever a patient faces a conflict between the comfort of regression and the demands of growth. Peter is trapped precisely in this psychological battleground. He wants affection, but fears what affection requires of him. Wendy's insistence on storytelling, nurturing, and structure exposes Peter to an entirely new way of organizing his inner world. Through her, he glimpses the possibility of shaping a coherent identity rather than drifting in endless play. But this coherence would demand that he accept time, that he recognize change, loss, and the progression from child to adult. Wendy, therefore, represents not just love, but the temporal dimension that Neverland denies. To accept her is to accept the clock, and Peter has devoted his entire existence to silencing its ticking. I interpret Wendy as the symbolic gateway to maturity, the emotional other who invites Peter into the world of relationships, ethics, and responsibility. She calls to him not with force, but with tenderness, reminding him that growing up does not mean abandoning joy or imagination, but expanding them into richer and more complex forms. Yet Peter's psyche, rigidly defended, perceives this expansion as a threat. To grow is to risk heartbreak, to love is to risk loss, and Peter Pan has built his identity precisely to avoid these dangers. Thus, his refusal of Wendy is not a rejection of her as a person, but a rejection of what she symbolizes, the inevitability of becoming a full subject. In fleeing from her, Peter preserves the illusion of eternal childhood, but at the cost of emotional depth. Wendy remains the forbidden bridge, the link between innocence and maturity, between fantasy and reality, between the fragmented boy and the adult he refuses to become. And so his tragedy is clear. He chooses safety over wholeness, flight over intimacy, and the endless game over the possibility of love. As I analyze this peculiar creature, the crocodile with a ticking clock inside its belly, I find myself confronted with one of the most fundamental truths of the human psyche, the inevitability of time. For Peter Pan, this crocodile is not merely a beast that stalks Captain Hook. It is the embodiment of what he spends his entire existence trying to deny. Each tick is a reminder of the passage from childhood to adulthood, a movement that Peter refuses to accept. In my clinical experience, I've often seen patients create elaborate fantasies to shield themselves from the progression of life, but none as imaginative or as symbolic as this relentless reptile. To Peter, the crocodile represents the ultimate anxiety, the real he cannot fully banish. While Neverland suspends time and grants eternal youth, the crocodile sneaks in as an intruder from the outside world, bringing with it the rhythm of reality. It mocks Peter's illusion that he can remain unchanged forever. The clock inside its body is no accident. It signifies the haunting awareness that development, maturation, and transformation continue whether one wants them to or not. So, even in a world built to freeze the psyche at the age of eternal play, time finds a way to demand acknowledgement. The creature's pursuit of Captain Hook further reveals its symbolic power. Hook, as I have already explained, is the harsh adult principle, the superego that demands order and maturity. The crocodile's obsession with him suggests that adulthood itself is perpetually hunted by the inevitable decay and finitude that time imposes. For Peter, witnessing this chase allows him to distance himself from the anxiety of aging. As long as the crocodile chases Hook, Peter can cling to the comforting illusion that time hunts others, never him. But this is merely another defense mechanism, a projection of his deepest fear onto the adult figure he most despises. In truth, Peter is not free from the crocodile's symbolic threat. Though he pretends that time cannot touch him, the creature's very presence in his world reveals an unconscious awareness that the fantasy cannot last. In clinical terms, the crocodile is the return of the repressed. Peter may suppress the knowledge that childhood must end, but his psyche cannot eliminate it entirely. Thus, the crocodile emerges as an externalized form of this forbidden truth, stalking the borders of his fantasy, waiting for the moment when denial is no longer sufficient. Each tick of the clock is like the pulse of an unwelcome thought. You must grow. This is the whisper that Peter refuses to hear. But repression is never absolute. The more fiercely one pushes a truth into the unconscious, the more forcefully it returns in disguised, symbolic forms. The crocodile is one such return. Its mechanical heartbeat echoes through Neverland, a constant reminder that time will eventually pierce even the strongest fantasies of eternal youth. It is this sound, more than the creature's teeth, that terrifies those who understand its meaning. If Peter were my patient, I would help him see that the fear of time often masks a deeper fear, the fear of loss. Growing means losing the omnipotence of childhood, the boundless imagination, the sense of being the center of one's own universe. It means confronting dependency, responsibility, and the limits of one's own body and mind. The crocodile does not merely symbolize time, it symbolizes every unwanted transformation that time brings with it. Peter flees not just from aging, but from the emotions, pains, and responsibilities that adulthood inevitably entails. In the end, the crocodile reveals the paradox at the heart of Peter Pan's psyche. He believes he can escape what is, in fact, unavoidable. The creature embodies the truth that no individual, no matter how magical or imaginative, can remain forever untouched by time. Peter's refusal to grow is ultimately a refusal to live fully, because life, by its very nature, is movement, maturation, and change. The crocodile's steady ticking exposes the fragility of his fantasy. And so, as I observe this symbol, I conclude, the crocodile is not Peter's enemy, it is his destiny, patiently waiting for him to accept the most fundamental law of human existence.